I am Cassidy, 34 years old, and the founder and chief executive officer of a highly successful supply chain technology firm. I woke up in a sterile VIP hospital room after suddenly collapsing during my fifth wedding anniversary dinner. My vision was blurred, but my hearing was crystal clear. Through the half-open door of my room, I heard my best friend whisper, asking if he was absolutely sure I took the final dose. My husband let out a quiet, satisfied laugh. He told her to relax and promised that by tomorrow morning, my entire company would be theirs. My blood ran cold, but I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I reached under the metal frame of my hospital bed, retrieved a hidden burner phone, and texted my corporate attorney exactly 4 words. Execute the plan now. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been betrayed by the people you trusted most and had to fight back to reclaim your life. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room stung my eyes as I slowly regained consciousness. The last thing I remembered was sitting across from Nolan at our favorite upscale restaurant in Manhattan. We were supposed to be celebrating 5 years of marriage. He had ordered an expensive bottle of vintage champagne. I remembered taking a sip, noting a faint, bitter metallic taste, and then the room began to spin violently. The mahogany walls of the restaurant had tilted the faces of the other diners, blurred into a chaotic smear of colors, and the floor rushed up to meet me. Now I was lying in a hospital bed with machines beeping rhythmically beside me. A heavy, unnatural exhaustion weighed down my limbs. I tried to move my arm, but my muscles felt like solid lead. That was when I heard the voices drifting in from the hallway. Nolan, the man I had promised to spend the rest of my life with, was standing just outside my door. He was a hedge fund manager who always wore custom-tailored suits and carried himself with effortless arrogance. Standing right beside him was Vanessa, my public relations director, and the woman I had considered my absolute best friend since our early 20s. Vanessa sounded frantic, her voice tight with anxiety as she paced the hallway. She asked Nolan what would happen if the doctors ran a full toxicology screen. She was terrified they would find the heavy metals in my system and trace it all back to them. Nolan hushed her immediately. His voice was smooth, dripping with the same manipulative charm he used to close multi-million-dollar deals. He told Vanessa that he had already taken care of everything. He bragged about slipping a generous envelope of cash to the attending physician. The doctor was going to diagnose me with a severe, unexplained neurological breakdown. Nolan promised Vanessa that the medical proxy would be active by sunrise, giving him total control over my personal assets and my company. Listening to them plot my demise did not break my heart. It ignited a fire of pure, calculating rage inside me. I had built my supply chain tech platform from absolute scratch. I spent my 20s living on cheap coffee and 4 hours of sleep a night coding algorithms and pitching to skeptical investors who thought a young woman could not disrupt the logistics industry. I fought tooth and nail for every single contract, every patent, and every dollar my company was worth. Nolan, on the other hand, was a parasite disguised as a prince. Over the past few months, I had noticed subtle discrepancies in our joint accounts. I had seen the stress tightening his jaw when he thought I was not looking. I already suspected his hedge fund was bleeding money, but I never imagined he would resort to attempted murder to cover his financial failures. And Vanessa, the woman who stood beside me when I cut the ribbon at my company headquarters, was apparently his willing accomplice. They thought I was just a naive, workaholic wife who would quietly fade away and leave them the keys to my kingdom. They were completely wrong. I forced my heavy body to shift slightly on the mattress. I ignored the throbbing pain in my temples and the nausea churning in my stomach. Slowly and silently, I slid my hand down the side of the mattress and reached beneath the cold metal frame of the hospital bed. My fingers brushed against a small rectangular object secured by a strip of heavy-duty tape. My brother-in-law DeAndre had planted it there yesterday. DeAndre was a brilliant African-American forensic accountant who had been helping me secretly audit Nolan over the past few weeks. We knew Nolan was desperate, and we knew he was planning a major move. My private security team had standing orders to bring me to this exact hospital and this specific room if I ever suffered a medical emergency. DeAndre had ensured the communication device was waiting for me. I peeled the tape away and pulled out the small burner phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim hospital room. I bypassed the lock screen and opened the messaging application. I selected the single contact saved in the phone. It was Vaughn, my ruthless 50-year-old corporate attorney who had navigated me through the most vicious boardrooms in the country. My thumbs moved quickly across the digital keyboard. I did not ask for help. I did not express fear. I simply typed the command we had agreed upon if Nolan finally crossed the line. Execute the plan, now. I hit send and watched the message status change to delivered. A profound sense of calm washed over me. The betrayal I had just witnessed would have destroyed a weaker woman. It would have sent someone else into a spiral of despair and heartbreak. But I was a chief executive officer. I dealt with hostile takeovers for a living, and my husband had just launched the most hostile takeover imaginable. I slipped the burner phone back under the mattress and carefully adjusted my blankets. I let my head fall back onto the pillows and slowed my breathing. I relaxed my facial muscles, practicing the exact look of a helpless, confused, and sickly wife. If Nolan and Vanessa wanted to play a deadly game of corporate espionage and medical sabotage, I was going to give them the performance of a lifetime. I closed my eyes and waited for the door to open, ready to welcome my enemies into the trap they had built for themselves. The heavy wooden door pushed open with a soft click. I kept my eyes half closed, letting my breathing remain shallow and erratic. Nolan burst into the room first. If I had not just heard him plotting my financial ruin in the hallway, I would have believed the performance. He rushed to my bedside, his custom-tailored suit wrinkling as he fell to his knees. He grabbed my hand, his grip tight and frantic. "Oh my God, Cassidy, you are awake!" He choked out the words, his voice breaking with manufactured relief. Perfectly timed tears welled in his eyes and spilled over his cheeks. He pressed my knuckles to his lips, putting on a display of husbandly devotion that belonged on a theater stage. Vanessa stepped into the room right behind him. She was dressed in a sharp beige trench coat, her makeup flawless, her expression twisted into a mask of deep concern. She hovered near the foot of my hospital bed, clasping her hands over her chest. She let out a dramatic sigh of relief and whispered how terrified they had been. I looked at the woman who had stood beside me through a decade of business launches and private celebrations. Her eyes met mine, and beneath the fake sympathy I saw the cold, calculating glint of a predator admiring its trapped prey. I forced my eyes to widen in mock panic. I let my voice tremble, asking what had happened, and why I felt so weak. Nolan stroked my hair, his touch sending a wave of revulsion through my entire body. He told me to stay calm, whispering that I had suffered a terrible medical emergency at dinner, but that I was safe now. He promised he was not going to leave my side. Before I could respond, the door swung open again. A tall man in a pristine white coat walked in holding a digital tablet. The doctor wore an expression of practiced gravity, but his eyes darted nervously toward Nolan for a fraction of a second before settling on me. That micro-expression was all the confirmation I needed. DeAndre was right. Nolan had bought this man. Dr. Aris introduced himself and took a deliberate breath before delivering the rehearsed script. He informed me that my test results were highly concerning. He used complex medical jargon, wrapping his lies in clinical authority. He stated that I had suffered a severe neurological breakdown, compounded by heavy metal toxicity of an unknown origin. "Heavy metals," I murmured, letting my voice crack with perfectly feigned terror. I asked how that was even possible. The doctor shook his head, keeping his face entirely devoid of emotion. He explained that these toxins can accumulate through environmental exposure or dietary anomalies. The critical issue, he stressed, was the immediate damage to my cognitive faculties. He looked directly at Nolan, then back to me, delivering the fatal blow. He said the toxicity had caused acute inflammation in my brain. He declared that for my own safety, I was temporarily unfit to make any complex personal, legal, or financial decisions. He insisted that the stress of running a tech firm would trigger a fatal relapse. The room went completely silent. I watched the performance unfold with the detached precision of an auditor reviewing a fraudulent ledger. Nolan buried his face in my blankets, his shoulders shaking as if the news had completely broken him. Vanessa let out a soft, theatrical gasp and covered her mouth. I knew exactly what they were waiting for. They needed me to surrender. They needed the strong, relentless chief executive officer to break down and hand over her armor. I gave them exactly what they wanted. I let out a sob, allowing my chest to heave. I squeezed Nolan's hand with all the weak strength I could muster. I pleaded with him, telling him I was scared, that my brain felt foggy, and that I did not know what to do. I begged him to tell me I was going to be all right. Nolan lifted his head. His eyes were red, his expression a masterpiece of fake compassion. He leaned in close, his breath brushing my cheek. He promised me he had everything under control. He told me not to worry about the company, the board of directors, or the medical bills. He swore he would step up and carry the weight so I could focus entirely on surviving. Vanessa moved to the other side of the bed. She placed her warm hand over my arm. She told me to listen to my husband. She promised to manage the public relations fallout at the office and keep the media away from my hospital room. She whispered that they were my family and that they would protect my legacy while I healed. I nodded slowly, letting a fresh wave of tears spill onto my pillow. I thanked them, my voice barely a whisper. I told them I did not know what I would do without them. Internally, a completely different narrative was playing out. My mind was sharp, calculating every variable, mapping out every vulnerability they were exposing. Their arrogance was blinding them. They thought they had neutralized the biggest threat in the room, completely unaware that they had just given me the ultimate advantage. By keeping me confined to this bed with a fake diagnosis, they were leaving me alone with unlimited time to execute my counteroffensive. I let my eyes flutter shut. I slumped slightly against the pillows, pretending that the sheer exhaustion of the diagnosis had drained the last of my energy. Nolan gently released my hand. I felt the mattress shift as he stood up. I heard the quiet rustle of Vanessa stepping back. They lingered by the door for a moment. They did not speak, but the silence between them was thick with victory. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the sterile room. I opened my eyes. The tears stopped instantly. My face settled back into a mask of absolute icy resolve. The board was set. They had made their opening move, relying on deceit poison and a bot doctor. Now they were going to learn what happens when you try to launch a hostile takeover against a woman who built an empire from dirt. I stared at the ceiling, analyzing the timeline Vaughn and I had established. Tomorrow Nolan would bring the legal paperwork. Tomorrow he would try to put a leash on me. And tomorrow I would hand him the rope he would eventually use to hang himself. The morning light filtering through the hospital blinds was harsh and unforgiving. I lay perfectly still against the stiff pillows, maintaining the shallow breathing of a woman completely broken by her own body. Right on schedule, the heavy wooden door swung open. Nolan walked in first, carrying a sleek black leather portfolio under his arm. He had clearly put effort into his appearance, loosening his expensive silk tie and rumpling his collar just enough to project the image of a devoted husband who had spent a sleepless night agonizing over his dying wife. Vanessa trailed closely behind him, holding 2 cups of premium coffee. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and a look of deep manufactured sorrow. They moved to either side of my bed, taking their positions like actors hitting their marks on a stage. Nolan placed the leather portfolio on the rolling tray table. He reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair away from my forehead. His touch made my skin crawl, but I leaned into his hand, fluttering my eyes open, as if waking from a deep, medicated fog. He leaned down, keeping his voice incredibly soft and entirely patronizing. He told me that he had been up all night managing the crisis. He claimed my sudden collapse had leaked to the press and sent shockwaves through the industry. According to his fabricated timeline, the board of directors was in a state of absolute panic. Suppliers were threatening to freeze shipments, and the company stock was poised for a catastrophic plunge the moment the market opened. Then he brought up the medical bills. He gestured around the luxurious VIP suite, noting the private nursing staff and the specialized treatments the corrupt doctor had ordered. He said the costs were astronomical, and my personal accounts were locked behind security protocols he could not bypass. With a heavy, dramatic sigh, Nolan unzipped the leather portfolio. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. He spread them out across my tray table. He explained that these were a comprehensive medical proxy and a durable power of attorney. He said he needed the legal authority to sign checks, approve vendor payments, and step in as the interim voice of the company to calm the terrified investors. He framed the entire hostile takeover as an act of selfless love. He begged me to let him carry my burden so I could focus entirely on surviving this terrible neurological breakdown. I stared at the documents, letting my eyes glaze over, as if the dense legal text was completely incomprehensible to my failing brain. I looked past Nolan and met Vanessa's gaze. She stepped closer to the bed, resting her hand lightly on my shoulder. She told me it was the only way to save the supply chain firm I had worked so hard to build. She promised that she and Nolan would handle all the ugly corporate warfare while I rested. Beneath her soothing tone, her eyes were burning with poorly concealed triumph. She was smirking already, imagining herself moving into my corner office and taking over my life. Nolan reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. It was the exact pen I had gifted him for our 3rd anniversary. The sheer audacity of using that specific pen to steal my life's work was poetic. He uncapped it and gently pressed the cold metal barrel into my right hand. This was my moment to deliver the performance that would seal their fate. I took a shallow, ragged breath. I forced my hand to tremble violently. My fingers shook so much that the pen slipped from my grip and clattered against the plastic tray table. I let out a pathetic, helpless whimper. Nolan immediately scooped up the pen, shushing me with fake apologies. He wrapped his large hand over my trembling fingers, guiding the pen back into position. He pointed to the dotted lines at the bottom of the final page, whispering that it would all be over soon. I looked up at him, allowing tears to pool in my eyes and spill over my cheeks. I let my voice crack with absolute desperate gratitude. I thanked him for saving me. I told him he was my hero and that I trusted him with my entire life. With my hand shaking perfectly, I dragged the golden nib across the paper. I signed my name in a jagged, distorted scrawl that flawlessly mirrored a woman suffering from severe cognitive decay. I repeated the performance on the 2nd page and then the 3rd, crying silent tears of thankfulness the entire time. The moment the final signature was complete, Nolan snatched the documents off the tray. He moved so fast he practically tore the paper. He could not completely hide the hungry, victorious gleam in his eyes as he blew on the ink to dry it. He slid the documents back into his leather portfolio and zipped it shut with a sharp, definitive sound. He and Vanessa exchanged a fleeting electric look of total conquest. They had done it. They had legally stripped me of my wealth, my company, and my autonomy without firing a single shot. Nolan kissed my cheek one last time. He promised they would return later that evening after he sorted out the immediate corporate fires at headquarters. Vanessa gave my arm a final patronizing squeeze. They turned and walked out of the hospital room, their steps quick and energized. The heavy door swung shut. The automatic lock engaged with a solid click. I sat up against the pillows. The violent trembling in my hands vanished instantly. I reached up and wiped the fake tears from my cheeks, my face settling back into a mask of cold, predatory calculation. I stretched my fingers, feeling the familiar steady strength return to my muscles. Nolan and Vanessa thought they had just walked out of this hospital with the keys to my empire. They thought the power of attorney gave Nolan unrestricted access to my pristine corporate accounts and my lucrative patents. They were entirely wrong. Months ago, my corporate attorney Vaughn and I had discovered the first red flags in Nolan's financial background. We had spent weeks preparing for the exact moment my husband would try to seize my assets. The documents Nolan just forced me to sign were not standard legal forms. Vaughn had drafted that specific power of attorney with hidden, highly complex corporate clauses buried deep within the legal jargon. By accepting the authority granted in that specific document, Nolan did not just gain the ability to sign checks on my behalf. He legally bound himself as the primary guarantor to a dummy corporation I had quietly established in a different state. That dummy corporation held massive toxic liabilities. The moment Nolan proudly presented that signed document to my board of directors, he would not be crowning himself king of a tech empire. He would be pulling the trigger on a legal landmine that would obliterate his remaining hedge fund capital and chain him to millions of dollars in fraudulent debt. I picked up my burner phone from beneath the mattress and stared at the dark screen. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the countdown to their absolute financial slaughter had officially begun. 3 days later, the corrupt physician finalized my discharge papers. I was wheeled out of the sterile hospital corridors and driven back to the sprawling modern estate I had purchased with my own money. But the moment the heavy mahogany front door clicked shut behind us, my luxurious sanctuary officially transformed into a maximum security prison. Nolan wasted absolutely no time enforcing his new rules. He guided me up the sweeping staircase to the master bedroom, fluffing my pillows and tucking me beneath the heavy duvet with a sickening display of false affection. Before I could even settle in, he reached across my nightstand. He picked up my primary smartphone and my sleek work laptop. His face arranged itself into a mask of deep protective concern. He told me that he had spoken extensively with the medical team about my recovery protocol. He claimed the doctors were terrified that any exposure to blue light or corporate stress would trigger another severe, potentially fatal neurological seizure. He kept his voice low and soothing, explaining that he was locking all of my electronic devices inside his biometric wall safe for my own protection. He insisted that the digital world was simply too dangerous for my fragile brain right now. I forced my eyes to widen in manufactured fear. I let out a shaky breath and thanked him profusely for guarding my health. I watched him walk out of the room with the hardware that connected me to my empire, knowing perfectly well that my actual lifeline was safely secured in a hidden location. By the end of the first week, Vanessa had practically moved into my home. She claimed she needed to be physically present to help Nolan manage the sudden overflow of executive duties while simultaneously keeping a watchful eye on my condition. In reality, she was taking her new position as the lady of the house for a test drive. It started with minor trespasses. I would wake up from a feigned afternoon nap to find her lounging on my custom velvet sofa drinking my expensive imported tea from my favorite porcelain cup. But her audacity quickly escalated. One afternoon, she strutted into my bedroom wearing my tailored silk robe. The unmistakable expensive scent of my signature French perfume trailed heavily behind her. She had invaded my closet, my bathroom, and my life. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to stand up from the mattress and physically throw her out the front door. Instead, I lay perfectly still as she perched herself at the foot of my bed, casually filing her manicured nails. She let out a long, dramatic sigh and began dropping carefully constructed hints about the state of my supply chain technology firm. She told me the executive floors were completely chaotic without my daily direction. She painted a grim picture of panicked investors, delayed shipping contracts, and nervous stakeholders demanding answers. But then her lips curved into a sickly, sweet, patronizing smile. She assured me that I had nothing to worry about because Nolan had stepped up brilliantly. She claimed he was doing a fantastic job calming the board of directors and navigating the corporate turbulence. She bragged that the senior partners were incredibly relieved to have a strong, decisive man taking the reins during my unfortunate physical decline. She spoke about my company as if it already belonged to him and by extension to her. I swallowed the burning disgust rising in my throat. I smiled weakly, letting my voice waver, and told her how incredibly blessed I was to have both of them holding my world together while I was so useless. The true test of my endurance was waiting for the sun to set. I spent my daylight hours performing the exhausting role of a fading dependent wife, but my nights belonged entirely to me. At exactly 3 in the morning, the estate was cloaked in absolute silence. Nolan was sound asleep on his side of our massive bed, his breathing deep and steady. I lay beside him, calculating the exact timing of my movements. I slid out from under the heavy duvet with practiced, agonizing slowness, ensuring the mattress did not shift or creak. I crept across the dark hardwood floor and slipped into the master bathroom, locking the solid oak door behind me. I turned on the shower, adjusting the water pressure to create a steady wall of white noise that would mask any sound. I dropped to my knees and reached into the narrow gap behind the custom marble vanity. My fingers closed around the sleek, cold plastic of my hidden burner phone. The glowing screen was my only source of light in the steamy darkness. I opened my encrypted messaging application and began typing a secure message to my ultimate trump card. I texted DeAndre. DeAndre was my sister Bridget's husband, a fiercely intelligent African-American forensic accountant who possessed a lethal ability to track hidden corporate money. He was a master at dissecting fraudulent ledgers and tracing offshore wire transfers. More importantly, he despised Nolan. DeAndre was the only person besides my attorney Vaughn who understood the full, terrifying scope of my husband's financial crimes. My thumbs moved rapidly across the digital keyboard. I instructed DeAndre to bypass the estate's exterior security cameras using the specific blind spot we had identified near the east garden wall months ago. I told him to meet me at the back patio entrance in exactly 24 hours. I needed the final damning evidence. I needed the hard copies of Nolan's offshore banking transactions and the definitive laboratory breakdown of the toxic heavy metals they had been slipping into my food. DeAndre replied less than 30 seconds later with a simple, pre-arranged confirmation code. I deleted the brief exchange, powered down the device, and secured it tightly back in its hiding place behind the vanity. I turned off the shower, dried my hands, and quietly unlocked the bathroom door. As I slipped back into bed beside the man who was actively trying to end my life, my heart beat with a steady, triumphant rhythm. Nolan and Vanessa believed they had locked me in a golden cage entirely cut off from the outside world. They thought I was a helpless prisoner waiting for the end. They did not realize that my golden cage was actually a heavily fortified command center. The pieces were moving perfectly into place, and the Shadow War was officially underway. Exactly 24 hours later, the grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway chimed 2 o'clock in the morning. The estate was submerged in total darkness. I slid out of bed, leaving Nolan tangled in the heavy duvet, entirely oblivious to my movements. I threw a thick cashmere wrap over my shoulders to ward off the biting night chill and made my way down the sweeping staircase. My bare feet made no sound against the polished hardwood. I slipped through the kitchen and quietly disengaged the secondary lock on the back patio door. The crisp night air hit my face as I stepped out into the shadows of the extensive manicured garden. I moved directly to the designated blind spot near the towering stone wall on the east side of the property. I waited in the pitch black, my heart beating with measured, steady precision. A faint rustle of ivy signaled his arrival. DeAndre emerged from the darkness. At 35 years old, my brother-in-law moved with a quiet, imposing athleticism. He was dressed entirely in black, a sharp contrast to his usual tailored accounting suits. DeAndre was a brilliant African-American forensic accountant who possessed a lethal eye for financial discrepancies. He was married to my sister Bridget, and he treated my family with fierce, unwavering loyalty. More importantly, he despised Nolan with every fiber of his being. DeAndre had always seen right through my husband's charming hedge fund manager facade, recognizing the greedy, incompetent fraud hiding underneath. DeAndre stepped onto the stone patio and handed me a heavy padded envelope. His dark eyes were intense, narrowed with a mixture of professional focus and deep personal disgust. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He told me the encrypted hard drives were inside. He said he had spent the last 48 hours tearing apart every single ledger, offshore routing number, and hidden portfolio connected to Nolan. I clutched the envelope against my chest. I asked him how bad the financial bleeding really was. DeAndre let out a low, humorless exhale. He told me it was a complete and absolute massacre. He explained that Nolan had not just made a few bad investments. 3 months ago, Nolan's highly touted hedge fund had suffered a catastrophic collapse. He had leveraged his client's capital on a series of highly volatile illegal trades and lost exactly $20 million. The loss was absolute. Nolan was drowning in toxic debt and facing imminent ruin. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. A $20 million deficit, explained the sudden frantic desperation. It explained why Nolan could not wait for a divorce settlement which my ironclad prenuptial agreement would have heavily restricted. He needed immediate, unrestricted access to my entire corporate empire to cover his massive fraud before the federal authorities noticed the missing funds. But DeAndre was not finished. He crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw tight with barely contained fury. He told me that a $20 million hole requires a lot of dirt to cover up. Nolan had been scrambling to hide his tracks from his furious investors. To keep the hedge fund artificially afloat, Nolan had started embezzling directly from our joint personal accounts and skimming from the secondary corporate accounts I had given him limited access to for household expenses. DeAndre pulled a small, sleek flashlight from his pocket and clicked it on, shielding the beam with his hand. He reached into the padded envelope and withdrew a stack of printed bank statements, highlighted in bright yellow ink. He held the papers under the narrow beam of light so I could read the undeniable hard numbers. DeAndre explained that Nolan had set up a web of phantom vendors and shell companies to siphon the money out of my account slowly. It was a sophisticated trick designed to bypass standard banking alerts, but it was child's play for a forensic accountant of DeAndre's caliber. He had tracked every single stolen dollar through the labyrinth of fake invoices. Then DeAndre pulled out one final document. It was a wire transfer confirmation heavily redacted by the bank but completely verified by DeAndre's software. He handed it to me, watching my face closely. He told me I needed to brace myself for this one. I looked down at the highlighted line. It was a single massive wire transfer for exactly $500,000. The money had been pulled directly from my private high-yield savings account just days before my medical collapse. I traced the routing numbers with my index finger, asking DeAndre where this specific $500,000 went. I assumed it was another desperate payment to a furious hedge fund investor. DeAndre shook his head, his voice dropping to a harsh, angry whisper. He told me it did not go to an investor. He tracked the routing number to an elite real estate brokerage downtown. Nolan had used my stolen money to purchase a luxury penthouse condo in one of the most exclusive high-rises in the city. I stared at the paper, the cold night air suddenly feeling sharp against my skin. I asked who held the deed. DeAndre looked me dead in the eyes. He told me the deed was listed entirely and exclusively under Vanessa's name. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it struck me like a physical blow. My husband had stolen $500,000 of my hard-earned money to buy a luxury love nest for my public relations director. Vanessa was sleeping in my house wearing my silk robes and performing the role of the devastated best friend, all while holding the deed to a penthouse purchased with my stolen wealth. A violent, white-hot fury ignited in the center of my chest, but I did not let it consume me. I channeled every ounce of that rage into pure tactical focus. Nolan and Vanessa thought they were brilliant criminals. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect crime, leaving me completely incapacitated while they spent my money and planned their future together. They had no idea that they had just handed a loaded weapon to a woman who knew exactly how to aim it. I slipped the documents back into the padded envelope. I looked up at DeAndre and thanked him. I told him this evidence was the exact leverage Vaughn and I needed to lock the trap permanently. DeAndre nodded, his expression grim and resolute. He told me there was one more thing inside the envelope, something far worse than stolen money and real estate betrayal. He pointed to a small, sealed plastic folder tucked behind the hard drives. He said the laboratory results had finally come back from the private toxicologist. We were about to discuss exactly what they had been putting in my food. I pulled the sealed plastic folder from the heavy padded envelope. The cold patio stones bit into my bare feet, but my entire focus was locked on the clinical white pages visible through the clear plastic. DeAndre stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. He warned me that what I was about to read went far beyond corporate embezzlement. This was not just a white-collar crime. This was a calculated, premeditated execution. DeAndre explained that tracing the offshore accounts had led him to a dark web shadow network. Nolan had not just been moving money to cover his hedge fund losses or buy luxury penthouses for his mistress. He had secured a black market credit card under a fabricated corporate identity. DeAndre hacked the transaction history and found a series of highly encrypted purchases made from an unregulated chemical supplier overseas. He pointed a steady finger at the laboratory report in my hands. The heavy metal ravaging my system, the invisible toxin that the corrupt hospital doctor had so conveniently failed to identify, was thallium. DeAndre laid out the horrifying reality of the substance. Thallium is a ghost. It is completely tasteless, colorless, and odorless. It dissolves perfectly in liquids and slowly dismantles the human nervous system piece by piece. It mimics a natural, rapid neurological decline, making the victim appear as though they are losing their mind and motor functions before their organs ultimately shut down. Nolan had been systematically dosing my food and drinks for weeks, turning my own home into a slow-moving execution chamber. My brother-in-law clenched his fists, his voice vibrating with absolute disgust. He laid out the motive with surgical precision. Nolan was staring down the barrel of a $20 million deficit. If he simply asked for a divorce, he would hit the titanium wall of the prenuptial agreement Vaughn and I had drafted before the wedding. That document guaranteed Nolan would walk away with absolutely nothing if the marriage dissolved. A divorce would mean immediate financial ruin and federal prison for his hedge fund fraud. He needed me entirely incapacitated or dead. If I was mentally incompetent, the power of attorney would give him total control of my supply chain empire, allowing him to sell it off to the highest bidder to cover his tracks. If I died, he would inherit everything as my grieving widower. It was a flawless, monstrous strategy designed to solve all of his problems with one lethal stroke. DeAndre braced himself, clearly expecting me to break down in tears. He reached out, offering a comforting hand, preparing to hold his sister-in-law as she processed the devastating fact that the man she married was actively murdering her. Instead, I looked up from the laboratory report and smiled. It was a cold, sharp, razor-thin smile that made DeAndre freeze in his tracks. I told him I was not surprised. In fact, I had known about the poison for exactly 32 days. DeAndre stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute shock. I kept my voice perfectly level and explained my own shadow war. A month ago, I had noticed a faint metallic bitterness in my morning espresso. A few days later, I found a microscopic trace of white powder on the rim of my daily vitamin capsules. A true chief executive officer never ignores an anomaly in her supply chain, especially when that supply chain involves her own body. I had scooped the powder into a sterile vial and sent it to a private independent toxicologist under a fake name. When the results came back positive for thallium, I did not call the police. I did not scream, confront Nolan, or run crying to a divorce attorney. A simple attempted murder charge would have sent him to prison, but it would have left his financial sabotage, his hidden assets, and his corporate accomplices hidden in the dark. I wanted to drag every single rat into the light. I wanted to watch him burn everything he cared about to the ground before I locked him in a cell. So I went on the offensive. I immediately sourced and started taking Prussian blue, the medical antidote for heavy metal toxicity, carefully masking the pills inside empty cosmetic containers in my bathroom. Every morning after Nolan enthusiastically handed me my spiked vitamins, I secretly swapped the capsules with harmless sugar pills. I dumped the poisoned coffee down the drain and poured myself a fresh cup while he was in the shower. I let him believe his toxic campaign was working perfectly. DeAndre listened in stunned, breathless silence as I revealed the final piece of the puzzle. The dramatic collapse at the luxury restaurant on our 5th anniversary was not a medical crisis at all. It was a highly orchestrated theatrical performance. I had taken a mild, fast-acting sedative right before dessert to artificially lower my heart rate, induce dizziness, and mimic the final stages of the poisoning. I forced the collapse to happen in a crowded public space to guarantee maximum exposure and force Nolan into a corner. By faking my neurological breakdown, I handed Nolan the exact opening he needed. I forced him to execute his fraudulent medical proxy deploy, his bot doctor, and sign the explosive power of attorney. I gave him the rope, and he eagerly wrapped it around his own neck. DeAndre let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head in sheer awe. He told me I was the most terrifying woman he had ever met. I handed the sealed plastic folder back to him. I instructed him to take the document straight to Vaughn. The financial evidence of the penthouse and the medical proof of attempted murder were the final keys to our trap. I turned my back to the cold garden wall and pulled my cashmere wrap tighter across my shoulders. It was time to go back inside and resume my role as the dying, helpless wife. The corporate slaughter was rapidly approaching, and I needed my rest to welcome the rest of the parasites into my home. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the estate. I was seated in the customized wheelchair Nolan had forced upon me, maintaining my carefully orchestrated posture of a decaying woman. Through the sweeping glass panels of the foyer, I watched the grand invasion begin. The heavy mahogany doors swung open to reveal my mother-in-law Patricia and my brother-in-law Richard. They did not simply walk into my home. They marched in like conquering generals claiming a captured territory. Behind them, a hired driver struggled to carry a massive tower of matching luxury suitcases. Patricia immediately enveloped Nolan in a theatrical, suffocating embrace, her shrill voice carrying up the curved staircase. She wailed about how devastated they were by the tragic news of my neurological collapse. She proclaimed that family must stick together during such dark times. She insisted that she and Richard had packed up their lives and rushed over to help care for poor Cassidy. It was a phenomenal piece of acting, matched only by the sheer entitlement of Richard. While Patricia wiped away non-existent tears, Richard did not even bother looking in my direction. He walked straight past his weeping mother, bypassed the formal living room, and headed directly for my private study. Within 60 seconds of crossing my threshold, I heard the distinct clink of heavy crystal. My unemployed brother-in-law was already pouring himself a generous measure of my rarest, most expensive imported scotch. Nolan played his part perfectly. He thanked his mother, his voice thick with fake exhaustion, claiming the burden of running my supply chain empire and managing my medical crisis was breaking him. Patricia patted his cheek, promising she would take over the entire domestic burden so he could focus on the corporate transition. By the following afternoon, Patricia dropped the grieving mother-in-law facade entirely. She did not come to my house to care for a sick woman. She came to erase me. I was resting in the master bedroom, keeping my breathing shallow and my eyes half closed, when Patricia marched through the door, carrying a towering stack of heavy cardboard moving boxes. She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not even acknowledge my presence on the mattress. She walked straight into my massive walk-in closet, pulled a roll of industrial packing tape from her pocket, and went to work. The screech of the tearing tape shattered the quiet of the bedroom. I watched through narrowed eyelids as Patricia began ruthlessly stripping my custom-tailored power suits, my silk blouses, and my limited-edition designer coats from their velvet hangers. She tossed them carelessly into the cardboard boxes like cheap rags. These were the clothes I had worn to ring the opening bell at the stock exchange, the armor I had worn to dominate brutal board meetings. Now they were being bundled up like trash. I forced a weak, trembling cough and asked her what she was doing. My voice was a fragile, airy whisper. Patricia did not pause her relentless packing. She casually tossed a pair of my expensive Italian leather heels into a box and waved her hand dismissively. She told me the medical staff had recommended clearing out unnecessary clutter to reduce my cognitive stress. She claimed she was boxing up my wardrobe to donate to charity, insisting that a woman in my rapidly declining condition had no use for corporate attire anymore. I knew perfectly well that those boxes were not going to a charity. They were going straight into the trunk of her car to be sold or altered for herself. I slumped back against the pillows, offering no resistance. I let her pack up thousands of dollars worth of my wardrobe, knowing every stolen item was just another nail in the coffin I was building for them. The true peak of her audacity came 48 hours later. I had navigated my wheelchair to the top of the grand staircase, maintaining my slow, sluggish movements. Below me, the main living room was buzzing with unexpected activity. A man in a heavy work belt was walking across my imported marble floors, aiming a red laser measuring device at my load-bearing walls. He was holding a digital tablet sketching out massive structural alterations. Patricia stood beside him, pointing aggressively at the floor-to-ceiling windows and demanding that the entire east wing of the house be gutted to create an open-concept entertainment pavilion. I gripped the wheels of my chair and rolled myself forward until I reached the edge of the landing. I called out to Patricia, letting my voice crack with manufactured confusion. I asked her why there was a contractor measuring the walls of my home. Patricia looked up at me. The contractor stepped away to take a phone call, leaving us entirely alone in the massive foyer. With Nolan out of the house executing his corporate theft, Patricia saw no reason to maintain her sweet, caring persona. She walked slowly up the first few steps of the staircase, her eyes locking onto mine. There was no sympathy left in her gaze, only a cold, venomous greed. She rested her hand on the polished oak banister, her diamond rings catching the morning light. She looked at me, not as a daughter-in-law, but as an obstacle that had finally been neutralized. Since you will be moving to an assisted living facility soon, I am redesigning the house for Nolan. It needs to fit his executive lifestyle. Her words were meant to crush my spirit. She delivered them with a sneer, fully expecting me to burst into tears, to beg for my home, or to spiral into a panicked neurological fit. She wanted the satisfaction of watching me realize that I was being buried alive while my husband and his family danced on my grave. I looked down at her from the top of the stairs. I did not cry. I did not scream. I let a slow, docile, empty smile spread across my face. I tilted my head perfectly, mimicking the vacant expression of a woman whose brain was slowly shutting down. I told her that was a wonderful idea. I kept my tone soft, breezy, and entirely cooperative. Then I leaned slightly forward in my wheelchair, my smile never wavering. Just make sure you keep the receipts. Patricia blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the odd response. Her brow furrowed, trying to search my vacant expression for any sign of defiance. When she found nothing but a blank, compliant smile, she scoffed. She muttered something under her breath about brain damage making me completely delusional, turned her back to me, and walked right back down the stairs to direct the contractor to rip out my custom fireplace. I sat quietly in my wheelchair, watching her direct the demolition of my living room. She thought my comment was the senseless babbling of a dying woman. She had absolutely no idea that my home was locked inside an impenetrable, irrevocable trust. She had no idea that she was currently ordering tens of thousands of dollars in unauthorized property damage. And she certainly had no idea that my legal team was going to use those exact contractor receipts to sue her into absolute inescapable bankruptcy. The alliance between my mother-in-law and my treacherous best friend was forged in mutual greed. With the contractor actively ripping out my living room downstairs, Patricia and Vanessa initiated the next phase of their strategy. They wanted to completely break my grip on reality and build a documented medical history of my cognitive collapse. The gaslighting began with subtle, calculated movements. I would leave my water glass on the right side of my bedside table, and when I woke from a staged nap, it would be moved to the vanity across the room. My reading glasses would vanish from my lap and reappear inside a zipped travel bag in the hallway. They would alter the temperature in my bedroom, change the channels on the television, while I looked away and adjust the brakes on my wheelchair so I would struggle to move. When I asked about the missing items playing the role of a confused, deteriorating patient, their performances were flawlessly cruel. Vanessa would place a cold hand on my forehead, her eyes wide with fake pity. She would tell me that I had just moved the glass myself 5 minutes ago. She would speak slowly, over enunciating her words as if talking to a toddler. Patricia would hover in the doorway, shaking her head with a loud, theatrical sigh. She would purposefully mutter to the private nurses about how tragic it was to watch a brilliant mind rot away into dementia. They wanted me to feel entirely unhinged. They needed the household staff to overhear these interactions, establishing a verbal third-party record of my insanity. I did not fight them. I let them move my things. I let them whisper about my failing memory to the staff. I simply smiled, nodded, and allowed my eyes to dart around the room in manufactured panic. But beneath the blanket draped over my lap, my hand rested on a high-grade digital audio recorder, taped securely to the underside of my wheelchair armrest. DeAndre had smuggled it to me during our midnight meeting. It was constantly running, capturing every lie, every sneer, and every manufactured symptom they tried to pin on me. The golden ticket arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I had wheeled myself to the edge of the second-floor landing, parking just out of sight of the main kitchen below. Patricia and Vanessa were sitting at my marble kitchen island, drinking my expensive vintage wine in the middle of the day. The acoustics of the open-concept foyer carried their voices perfectly up the stairs. I pressed the record button, the tiny red light blinking to life under my palm. Downstairs, Patricia was laughing. She reached across the counter and patted Vanessa's hand. I listened breathless with focus, as my mother-in-law explicitly outlined her betrayal. Patricia told Vanessa how thrilled she was that Nolan had finally found someone who understood his needs. She stated in crystal-clear audio that she had known about their affair for over 6 months. She actually praised Vanessa for her patience, calling her so much more agreeable than me. Patricia complained that a man of Nolan's caliber never should have married a ruthless, unfeeling corporate machine who cared more about supply chain algorithms than her own husband. Vanessa chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She promised Patricia that she would be a much better wife, noting that once I was safely locked away in a psychiatric care facility, they could finally be a real family. Patricia raised her glass, proposing a loud toast to Nolan's upcoming freedom and the child Vanessa was secretly carrying. I sat in the shadows of the landing, the digital recorder capturing every single damning syllable. They were writing their own legal death warrants. In a court of law, this audio would not just prove adultery, it proved a coordinated, premeditated conspiracy involving multiple family members to defraud a disabled spouse. I secured the recorder back under the armrest, my blood buzzing with cold, focused energy. I had the financial documents, I had the toxicology reports, and now I had the vocal confessions of the co-conspirators. Before the clink of their wine glasses could even fade, the heavy front door swung open with a massive thud. The sudden noise echoed through the grand foyer, startling the women in the kitchen. I leaned forward in my chair, peering down through the wooden balusters. Nolan strode into the house. He was hours earlier than his usual return time. He was not wearing his standard business casual office attire. He was dressed in a brand new razor-sharp charcoal bespoke suit that screamed of newly acquired unearned wealth. He looked like a king returning from a victorious crusade. Vanessa and Patricia rushed out of the kitchen to greet him, their faces lighting up with eager anticipation. Nolan did not embrace them. He stood in the center of the marble floor, radiating an arrogant electric energy. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and looked up the stairs, his eyes locking onto my frail, wheelchair-bound figure in the shadows. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He announced that the waiting was officially over. His voice boomed through the quiet house, filled with absolute certainty and terrifying triumph. He told us that he had just issued a mandatory emergency summons to my entire board of directors. A definitive corporate assembly was scheduled for exactly 8 o'clock the next morning. He kept his eyes burning into mine, savoring what he thought was his final victory. He declared that it was time to finalize the transition. The hostile takeover of my life's work was shifting from the shadows directly into the boardroom. The morning of the emergency board meeting arrived with a tense, suffocating quiet over the estate. I sat motionless in my wheelchair by the bay window of the master bedroom, watching Nolan's sleek black car pull out of the driveway. He was headed downtown to the glass tower that housed my supply chain technology firm. He thought he was driving to his coronation. He had absolutely no idea he was driving straight into a slaughterhouse. As soon as his car disappeared past the security gates, I reached behind the heavy velvet drapes and retrieved my burner phone. I pressed a single button to join a secure, encrypted audio stream. Vaughn, my ruthless corporate attorney, had already slipped a micro-transmitter into his breast pocket before walking into the boardroom. Through the tiny speaker pressed against my ear, I was given a front-row seat to the exact moment my husband attempted to steal my empire. The audio feed was crystal clear. I heard the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swing shut, sealing in my 12 senior directors. Then Nolan's voice echoed across the expansive room. He did not start with standard corporate pleasantries. He dove straight into his theatrical performance of the devastated broken husband. He told my board of directors that he carried a burden of profound tragedy. He claimed my condition had deteriorated far beyond what anyone had anticipated. I listened with icy detachment as Nolan unzipped his leather portfolio. I heard the crisp rustle of heavy bond paper being slid across the polished mahogany table. He presented the forged medical documents from his bought doctor. He pointed to the falsified toxicology reports and the fabricated neurological assessments. He kept his voice steady, laced with perfectly manufactured grief, as he informed the board that I was suffering from irreversible cognitive decay caused by severe heavy metal poisoning. He explicitly stated that I was entirely incapable of distinguishing reality from fiction, let alone capable of managing a multi-million-dollar technology enterprise. A low murmur of shock and panic rippled through the boardroom. I recognized the voice of Thomas, my chief financial officer, asking if there was any chance of my recovery. Nolan let out a heavy, tragic sigh. He told Thomas that the damage to my brain was permanent. Then, without missing a beat, Nolan laid his trap. He pulled out the durable power of attorney I had signed in the hospital room. He slapped it down on the table, declaring that he was now my sole legal and financial proxy. Nolan did not give the board a single second to process their grief. He immediately weaponized their panic. He reminded them that the market hated uncertainty. He painted a terrifying picture of our biggest suppliers preparing to freeze shipments and our top investors threatening to pull their capital the moment the news of my mental collapse leaked to the press. He positioned himself not just as my husband but as the only viable savior for the entire corporation. With absolute staggering arrogance, Nolan demanded that the board invoke the corporate incapacity clause. He forced a mandatory immediate vote to officially oust me from my position. He demanded to be installed as the acting chief executive officer, effective immediately. To twist the knife even further, he announced that Vanessa would be elevated to executive vice president. He claimed she was the only person equipped to manage the inevitable public relations nightmare and maintain internal morale. Through the audio feed, I heard the hesitation. These were smart, seasoned business professionals, but Nolan had cornered them with legally binding paperwork and the terrifying threat of imminent corporate collapse. One by one, I heard them verbally cast their votes. The resolution passed. The gavel struck the table. In a matter of minutes, Nolan had legally seized the crown. He was the undisputed acting CEO of my company, and Vanessa was his second in command. I ended the secure audio stream and tucked the burner phone away. The corporate takeover was officially on paper. It was time for me to play my part in this masterpiece of deception. I knew Nolan had installed hidden microphones and wiretaps throughout the estate to monitor my supposed mental decline. He wanted to hear me break. He wanted the visceral satisfaction of listening to my absolute defeat. I was more than happy to oblige. I wheeled myself into the center of the bedroom, positioning myself directly beneath the smoke detector, where I suspected one of his listening devices was hidden. Right on schedule, the heavy, ornate landline phone on my bedside table began to ring. It was an unencrypted, fully monitored line. I picked up the receiver with a trembling hand. Vaughn was on the other end. My brilliant 50-year-old attorney deserved an Academy Award for the performance he delivered. He sounded breathless, frantic, and entirely defeated. Over the open line, Vaughn stammered out the news. He told me that Nolan had just staged a ruthless coup. He explained that the board had voted to remove me, that Nolan was the new CEO, and that Vanessa had been given executive control. He claimed he tried to stop them, but the medical proxy and the power of attorney were simply too airtight to challenge. I let out a loud, agonizing wail. I forced my breathing to become erratic, hyperventilating directly into the receiver. I screamed that it was my company, my life, and my entire legacy. I begged Vaughn to file an emergency injunction. I pleaded with him to go to the authorities to tell the board that Nolan was lying. I let heavy, genuine-sounding sobs rack my chest, crying hysterically into the phone. Vaughn played his role perfectly, offering hollow apologies and claiming his hands were legally tied. He told me there was nothing more we could do to stop the transition of power. He advised me to just rest and let Nolan take over. I dropped the phone, letting it clatter loudly against the hardwood floor. I buried my face in my hands and let out a series of broken, pathetic sobs that echoed off the high ceiling of the master bedroom. I knew Nolan would retrieve these audio files later. I knew he would sit in my office drinking my expensive scotch and listen to the sound of his wife completely breaking down. He would revel in his absolute victory, his ego fed to the point of bursting. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he could not see the truth. The tears running down my face were not born of grief. They were tears of pure, unadulterated anticipation. Nolan had just legally chained himself to the steering wheel of a sinking ship. He had forcefully claimed the title of Chief Executive Officer, entirely oblivious to the massive, lethal financial payload that title now carried. The heavy front doors of the estate swung open later that evening with a forceful, triumphant crash. The sound of Nolan's booming laughter echoed up the sweeping staircase and bounced off the high ceilings of the foyer. I sat in my wheelchair, hidden deep within the shadows of the second-floor landing, looking down through the wooden balusters. Nolan did not simply walk into the house. He paraded into it. He had shed his suit jacket, his expensive silk tie was loosened, and he was radiating the manic electric energy of a man who believed he had just conquered the world. Patricia and Vanessa practically sprinted out of the formal dining room to greet him. Vanessa threw her arms around his neck, completely abandoning any lingering pretense of being my supportive best friend. She kissed him squarely on the mouth, right in the center of my marble foyer, entirely unbothered by the fact that they were standing in my home. Patricia clasped her diamond-covered hands together, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation, demanding to know exactly how the boardroom execution had played out. Nolan stepped back breathless and buzzing with adrenaline. He declared that it was a total bloodbath and an absolute triumph. He bragged to his mother and his mistress that my board of directors had surrendered without a single fight the moment he dropped the fabricated medical evaluations and the signed legal proxy onto the polished mahogany table. He told them he had successfully ousted me, seized the title of acting chief executive officer, and installed Vanessa as his second in command. But taking the corporate throne was only the opening act. Nolan marched into my living room, the exact room his mother was so eager to demolish, and threw a thick legal folder onto the glass coffee table. He commanded them to look at the paperwork. He announced that he had not just taken over the supply chain technology firm. He had immediately bypassed the board of directors to execute a unilateral, highly aggressive executive action. He had spent the entire afternoon sitting in a downtown boardroom with the executive leadership team of Apex Corporation. The mention of that name sent a cold thrill through my veins. Apex Corporation was my fiercest competitor. They were a ruthless, monopolistic giant that I had personally fought off for the last 6 years. I had publicly humiliated their leadership team time and time again by outbidding them on massive government logistics contracts. Selling out to Apex was the ultimate corporate betrayal. It was a knife driven directly into the heart of my professional legacy. Nolan knew exactly how much I despised them, which made his next announcement all the more sickening to the people standing in my living room. Nolan tapped his finger violently against the signature line of the preliminary agreement. He boasted that he had just agreed to sell a 60% controlling stake of my company to Apex. The purchase price was a staggering $50 million. Patricia gasped loudly, covering her mouth, as she sank onto my custom velvet sofa. Vanessa let out a sharp squeal of pure, unrestrained greed, wrapping her arms around Nolan once again. Nolan paced the room, running his hands through his hair, manic with the high of his own perceived brilliance. He broke down the mathematics of his salvation for the two women. He explained that the $50 million would be wired into a newly established corporate account by the end of the week. The moment the funds cleared, he would immediately siphon off $20 million to quietly fill the massive gaping crater he had blown into his hedge fund. He promised them that the federal authorities would never even know the money had been missing. The remaining $30 million would be theirs to keep entirely free and clear. He promised his mother her extravagant architectural renovations. He promised Vanessa a life of absolute luxury. They were going to be obscenely, untouchably wealthy, and it was all going to be funded by the ashes of my life's work. Richard sauntered into the living room from the hallway, clearly having raided my private climate-controlled wine cellar. He was carrying 3 bottles of my most exclusive vintage French champagne. These were rare bottles I had personally imported to celebrate my company hitting its first major revenue milestone years ago. Now Richard was carelessly popping the corks, letting the expensive foam spill completely unchecked over my imported rugs. He grabbed a handful of crystal flutes from the bar cart and handed the poured drinks to Nolan, Vanessa, and Patricia. Nolan raised his crystal flute high into the air. He proposed a loud, mocking toast to his brilliant, tragic wife. He thanked me for working myself into an early neurological grave just to hand him the winning lottery ticket. The 4 of them laughed. It was a cruel, echoing, venomous sound that amplified the sheer arrogance of their conspiracy. They clinked their glasses together and drank my vintage champagne, happily toasting to my permanent demise. I sat perfectly still in my wheelchair at the top of the stairs. The plush carpeting absorbed any faint sound of my presence. My face was completely blank. I did not feel a single ounce of betrayal, sadness, or heartbreak as I watched my husband celebrate my destruction with his pregnant mistress and his parasitic family. Those emotions belonged to a victim, and I was not a victim. I was the architect of their impending annihilation. I looked down at Nolan as he drained his glass of champagne. By signing that preliminary agreement with Apex Corporation, he had done exactly what my attorney Vaughn and I desperately needed him to do. He had not just claimed the title of acting chief executive officer on paper. By executing a binding multi-million-dollar corporate sale with a major competitor, he had legally solidified his absolute undeniable liability over the corporate entity. He had cemented himself in the eyes of the law as the sole responsible acting party for the business. The trap required him to take decisive, irreversible financial action on behalf of the company. If he had just sat in the executive chair and done nothing, his lawyers might have later argued that he was merely a passive proxy trying to hold things together. But the Apex deal was the final nail in his coffin. I mentally checked off the absolute last box on my tactical list. The legal snare was now fully primed and locked. There was no backing out for him, no legal loopholes, and no claiming ignorance. He thought he had just signed a $50 million golden ticket that would erase his crimes and buy him the world. He had absolutely no idea he had just signed a $40 million suicide pact. I backed my wheelchair quietly into the dark shadows of the hallway and turned back toward the master bedroom, content to leave them downstairs to enjoy their final fleeting night of unearned victory. The lingering scent of spilled vintage champagne from the night before wafted up the grand staircase. I remained in my master bedroom draped in a heavy knitted blanket, staring out the window at the manicured grounds. The door did not open with a soft, cautious push this time. It swung open violently, rebounding off the wall with a sharp, aggressive crack. Nolan marched into the room. He wore no rumpled collar, no fake tears, and no mask of a grieving husband. He was dressed in a pristine navy bespoke suit, his posture rigid with absolute unchecked authority. He did not bother asking how I was feeling or pretending to care about my fabricated neurological decline. He walked straight to my wheelchair and threw a thick legal-size manila folder directly onto my lap. The heavy thud of the paper hitting my thighs was meant to be a physical punctuation of his absolute power. He looked down at me, his eyes completely stripped of all warmth and humanity. He stated that the charade was officially over. He said there was no need for him to pretend to be a caretaker anymore, because he had already won the war. He pointed a sharp finger at the folder on my lap and announced that those were divorce papers. He bragged that his lawyers had worked through the night to draft a settlement that reflected his new reality. According to his twisted, arrogant logic, my supply chain technology firm was now legally his property to sell and dismantle as he saw fit. He then boldly declared that he had already initiated the paperwork to transfer the deed of our estate entirely into his own name, utilizing the sweeping power of attorney I had signed in the hospital. He wanted me out of his house, out of his newly acquired company, and out of his life forever. Before I could even register the sheer delusion of his real estate claims, a second figure stepped into the bedroom. Vanessa glided past the doorframe. She was not wearing her usual sharp public relations business attire. She wore a soft, clinging cashmere dress that hugged her figure perfectly. She walked right up to Nolan and wrapped her arm intimately through his. Then she placed her other hand deliberately and protectively over her lower stomach. She looked down at me with a smile so dripping in venom it could have stripped paint off the walls. She rubbed her stomach in slow, circular motions, a visual taunt designed to break my spirit. She stated that Nolan needed a fresh start because they were building a real future together. She let the words hang in the air for a heavy moment before delivering what she thought was the ultimate fatal blow. She announced she was pregnant. She claimed she was carrying the child Nolan had always wanted, the rightful heir to the corporate empire he had just claimed. She practically purred the words, twisting the knife into the infertility struggles she thought had weakened me years ago. She declared that a sick, decaying woman had no place in the vibrant, wealthy new life they were preparing to create. Nolan took over the conversation, his voice hardening into a brutal, unforgiving edge. He leaned over my wheelchair, gripping the armrest to trap me in place. He laid out his ultimatum with absolute, terrifying clarity. He commanded me to pick up a pen and sign the divorce papers immediately. The settlement offered me a pathetic, bare minimum monthly stipend, just enough to cover basic living expenses. However, that money came with a massive condition. I had to agree to voluntarily check myself into a highly remote private psychiatric facility by the end of the week. He promised that if I went quietly and accepted my fate as a mentally unstable, discarded wife, he would ensure the facility kept me comfortable while my brain rotted away in isolation. But if I refused to sign, if I tried to fight him in court, he promised absolute scorched earth destruction. He reminded me that he held the power of attorney and the acting chief executive officer title. He threatened to instantly freeze every bank account, cancel my premium health insurance, and legally drain every single asset I had ever acquired. He swore he would throw me out of the front door with nothing but the clothes on my back, leaving me penniless, medically abandoned, and freezing on the street. He looked me dead in the eyes and stated that I had exactly 24 hours to make my decision. I could sign the papers and disappear into an asylum or face total financial and physical annihilation. I looked up at the man I had married and the woman I had called my best friend. The sheer, breathtaking malice radiating from them was a masterpiece of human depravity. They desperately wanted to see me shatter. They needed the visceral satisfaction of watching my final sliver of hope crumble into dust. I gave them exactly what they ordered. I let my lower lip tremble violently. I looked down at the manila folder on my lap, my breathing hitching into jagged, panicked gasps. I raised my shaking hands to my face, letting out a stifled, broken whimper. I shrank back into the cushions of the wheelchair, curling my shoulders inward to make myself look as small and defeated as physically possible. I whispered that I did not want to be locked away in a facility. I pleaded with them, my voice cracking, asking how they could do this to me after a decade of trust and friendship. Nolan simply straightened his tie, utterly unmoved by my flawless performance. He turned to Vanessa and told her it was time to leave for the hotel. They were hosting a massive victory gala downtown that evening to celebrate their engagement and the merger with Apex Corporation. They needed to supervise the event staff and prepare to be the toast of high society. He looked back at me one last time, his lip curling in profound disgust. He ordered me to have my bags packed and the papers signed by the time they returned from the party. They turned and walked out of the master bedroom, arm in arm. The heavy door closed behind them, shutting me inside with the ultimate proof of their treachery. I sat in the silent room for exactly 5 seconds, listening to the fading sound of their footsteps echoing down the stairs. Then the trembling stopped completely. I picked up the thick stack of divorce papers and tossed them onto the floor like a piece of meaningless trash. The time for hiding in the shadows was over. The time for playing the helpless victim had officially expired. They had laid out their final threat, and now it was my turn to respond. I remained perfectly still in the center of the master bedroom, listening to the chaotic symphony of their departure playing out downstairs. Patricia was shouting instructions at Richard, her voice shrill with excitement as she demanded he carry her velvet evening wrap to the car. She bragged loudly to the hired household staff that tonight was the dawn of a new dynasty. I heard the sharp click of Vanessa's designer heels striking the marble foyer, followed by Nolan's booming voice urging them to hurry. He declared that the executive leadership team of Apex Corporation was already waiting for them in the VIP ballroom of the downtown Grand Hotel. They were treating this evening as their ultimate coronation. They had rented out the entire top floor of the luxury venue to host a massive victory and engagement gala, completely funded by the corporate credit cards Nolan thought he now controlled. The heavy mahogany front doors slammed shut with a definitive echoing thud. The sudden silence that fell over the estate was absolute. I walked to the bay window and watched the caravan of sleek black town cars roll down the private driveway and disappear past the wrought iron security gates. They were finally gone. The second the taillights vanished into the dusk, I kicked the heavy knitted blanket off my lap. I stood up from the medical wheelchair. There was no hesitation, no weakness, and absolutely no tremor in my limbs. I rolled my shoulders back and straightened my spine, physically shedding the pathetic, fragile persona I had worn for the past month. The lingering ache of playing a dying woman evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I kicked the empty wheelchair aside, watching it roll uselessly into the corner of the room. It was time to resurrect the chief executive officer. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet. Patricia had spent days ruthlessly packing up my everyday corporate wear, maliciously throwing my silk blouses and tailored coats into cardboard boxes. But my mother-in-law was a superficial woman who only saw what was directly in front of her. She had completely failed to notice the subtle, reinforced paneling behind my floor-to-ceiling dressing mirror. I pressed my palm against the hidden biometric scanner concealed within the wooden molding. A faint green light scanned my fingerprints, followed by the heavy, satisfying click of a mechanical deadbolt retracting. The mirror swung open to reveal a steel fireproof wall safe built directly into the foundation of the house. This safe was my true command center. Inside sat my original passport's physical backups of the encrypted hard drives DeAndre had provided, and a heavy, opaque garment bag I had securely tucked away the day Vaughn and I first finalized our counteroffensive. I reached into the steel vault and pulled the garment bag out into the light. I unzipped the thick canvas. Inside hung a flawless, custom-tailored crimson power suit. It was a masterpiece of sharp, aggressive architecture cut from the finest Italian wool and designed to command absolute authority in any boardroom it entered. I stripped off the oversized drab sweatpants and the shapeless cotton shirt Nolan had forced me to wear during my supposed convalescence. I slipped my arms into the crimson blazer. The fabric felt like a second skin, a suit of armor forged in the fires of their betrayal. I fastened the matching trousers and stepped into a pair of razor-sharp black stiletto heels. The transformation was electric. I was no longer the tragic discarded wife waiting to be institutionalized. I was the apex predator preparing to step back onto the hunting ground. I walked out of the closet and sat down at my vanity. The woman staring back at me in the mirror had pale, unblemished skin and eyes that burned with cold, calculating fury. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a sleek gold tube of my signature red lipstick. It was the exact shade I wore when I rang the bell at the stock exchange, the color I wore when I ruthlessly acquired my first competitor. I applied the vibrant crimson to my lips with slow, deliberate precision. The bold color brought my face back to life, erasing the sickly, fragile ghost Nolan thought he had left behind. I snapped the gold cap back onto the lipstick tube. The sound was as sharp as a firing pin. I walked back to the hidden safe and retrieved the untraceable burner phone. I navigated to the encrypted communication application and initiated a secure three-way conference call. The line connected after a single ring. Vaughn answered first, his voice entirely stripped of the panicked, helpless attorney persona he had played earlier that morning. DeAndre joined a fraction of a second later, the sound of a revving car engine echoing in his background. Neither man asked if I was all right. They knew exactly what phase of the operation we had entered. I looked down at the discarded divorce papers scattered across my bedroom floor. I stepped directly on the signature line Nolan had arrogantly demanded I sign, driving the sharp heel of my stiletto straight through the heavy paper. I lifted the phone to my ear. I kept my voice perfectly level, radiating the absolute terrifying calm of a woman who held the remote detonator to her enemy's lives. "The rats are all in one cage," I said, staring at my fierce reflection in the mirror. "Let us go burn it down." Vaughn let out a low, satisfied chuckle. He confirmed that his legal team was already stationed in the lobby of the downtown hotel, holding the certified, ironclad transfer documents. DeAndre announced that he was sitting in an unmarked black sport utility vehicle parked right outside my estate gates, waiting to serve as my personal escort. He had the two federal agents sitting in the back seat holding the final financial warrants and the toxicology reports. I ended the call and slipped the burner phone into the inner pocket of my crimson blazer. I turned my back on the wheelchair, the pill bottles, and the fake illness that had served as my perfect camouflage. I walked out of the master bedroom, the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels echoing through the empty, silent house. Nolan thought he was hosting the ultimate celebration of his brilliance. He thought he was about to toast to $50 million and his brand new life. He was about to find out that the woman he tried to bury had just climbed out of the dirt, and she was bringing hell with her. The black sport utility vehicle cut through the downtown traffic with lethal purpose. DeAndre sat in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel with quiet, focused intensity. The two federal agents in the back remained completely silent, their presence a heavy anchor of incoming justice. We pulled up to the valet stand of the Grand Hotel, the tires screeching slightly against the pavement. I stepped out into the cool night air, the vibrant fabric of my crimson suit, acting as a visual declaration of war against the muted darkness of the city. Vaughn was waiting for us in the glittering marble lobby holding a sleek leather briefcase that contained the absolute destruction of my husband. My attorney gave me a single approving nod, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a courtroom bloodbath. We bypassed the standard elevators entirely and took the private express car directly to the top-floor VIP ballroom. As the elevator doors slid open, the muffled sound of polite applause and clinking crystal greeted us. We stood in the dimly lit antechamber just outside the massive gold-leafed double doors of the main ballroom. Through the heavy wood, I could hear Nolan's voice amplified over the state-of-the-art sound system. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He was painting himself as the tragic, reluctant hero who had valiantly stepped up to save a crumbling empire from a hopelessly ill wife. I listened as he raised his glass, offering a loud, booming toast to the executive leadership team of Apex Corporation. He thanked them for their partnership, their trust, and their $50 million investment in his brilliant new vision for the company. Then his voice softened into a sickeningly sweet tone as he dedicated the night to his beautiful pregnant fiancée, Vanessa, claiming they were ushering in a glorious, highly profitable new era together. I did not wait for the ensuing applause to die down. I placed my hands flat against the center of the heavy double doors and pushed them open with a forceful, echoing crash. The sheer violence of the sound cut through the ballroom like a gunshot. 500 heads snapped toward the entrance simultaneously. The room was a sea of black tuxedos and glittering evening gowns populated by the most elite members of high society top-tier investors and the predatory executives of Apex Corporation. I stepped over the threshold, my crimson power suit burning like a flare against the muted elegance of the room. Vaughn flanked my right side, gripping his briefcase like a weapon. DeAndre flanked my left, his posture radiating absolute, impenetrable authority. The two federal agents stepped in right behind us, their silver badges catching the light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. The upbeat jazz music abruptly cut out. The cheerful chatter evaporated into a deafening, suffocating silence. As I walked forward, the massive crowd instinctively parted, creating a wide, unobstructed path straight down the center of the ballroom. It was exactly like watching the Red Sea part. I heard the sharp, frantic gasps of the investors and board members who recognized my face. I saw Patricia and Richard standing near the front row, their champagne flutes frozen in midair. Their faces contorted into masks of pure, unadulterated horror. They were staring at a ghost who had suddenly materialized in a tailored suit, entirely unable to comprehend how the woman they had left rotting in a wheelchair was currently marching toward them with the force of a hurricane. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead, marching directly toward the elevated stage. Nolan was standing at the acrylic podium, a glass of vintage champagne in one hand and the microphone in the other. When his eyes finally registered my presence, his brain entirely short-circuited. All the arrogant color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified child. His fingers went completely slack. The heavy microphone slipped from his grip and plummeted to the wooden stage, hitting the floor with a piercing, high-pitched screech of electronic feedback that made half the room cover their ears and wince in pain. The champagne flute followed a second later, shattering into 100 pieces around his expensive leather shoes, the expensive liquid soaking into the hem of his bespoke trousers. Vanessa was standing just a few feet away from him, wearing a clinging white silk gown, specifically chosen to highlight her slight baby bump. The smug, victorious glow that had defined her features for the past month completely vanished. She turned the color of freshly poured concrete, her hands dropping awkwardly to her sides. She took a stumbling, frantic step backward, her high heels catching on the stage carpeting. She looked as if the floor had just opened up to swallow her alive, her eyes darting wildly toward the exit doors guarded by the federal agents. I did not stop my relentless march until I reached the very edge of the stage, standing right below my paralyzed husband. I was not the frail, weeping, brain-damaged victim they had left shivering in the dark just a few hours ago. My posture was flawless, my breathing was perfectly calm, and my gaze was absolutely lethal. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting for the impending explosion. Nolan opened his mouth, his jaw working up and down, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He stood there trembling violently, desperately trying to compute how the woman he systematically poisoned was currently staring him down with the full backing of the legal system and the federal government. I tilted my head, letting a cold, razor-sharp smile touch my red lips. The stage was finally mine, and I was about to deliver the final act. I stepped gracefully over the shattered remains of Nolan's champagne glass. The sharp crunch of crystal under my black stilettos echoed through the silent ballroom. I walked up the short flight of stairs and took my place directly beside him at the acrylic podium. Nolan shrank back, his chest heaving as if he could not pull enough oxygen into his lungs. I reached out and calmly picked up the secondary microphone resting on the stand. I tapped it once. The sharp thump reverberated through the massive speakers, ensuring that every single executive, investor, and socialite in the room had their undivided attention fixed entirely on me. I turned my head and looked directly into my husband's terrified, bloodshot eyes. I let my signature red lips curve into a bright, chilling smile. "Did you really think a supply chain chief executive officer would not track her own inventory?" I asked, my voice ringing out with absolute, unwavering clarity. "I knew about the thallium 3 months ago." The word dropped like a physical bomb into the center of the room. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The executives from Apex Corporation exchanged alarmed, confused glances. Nolan staggered backward, his pristine, bespoke suit suddenly looking like a poorly fitted costume. He opened his mouth, desperately trying to formulate a defense, trying to summon the charming, manipulative hedge fund manager persona that had served him for years. He stammered that I was sick, that the heavy metals had completely destroyed my mind, and that this was a tragic, paranoid hallucination. I did not argue with him. I simply raised my free hand and gave a sharp, definitive nod toward the back of the ballroom. DeAndre had not remained idle by the doors. My brilliant brother-in-law had moved with swift, tactical precision straight to the main audiovisual control booth. The massive high-definition presentation screens mounted behind the stage were currently glowing with the golden logo of the Apex merger. In a fraction of a second, DeAndre hijacked the entire digital feed. The corporate logos vanished. They were instantly replaced by a series of glaring high-resolution documents blown up to 20 feet tall for the entire ballroom to witness. I turned to the audience and began my presentation. I did not speak with anger or hysteria. I delivered the facts with the clinical, merciless efficiency of an auditor exposing a fraudulent ledger. I gestured to the massive screens behind me. I explained that what they were looking at were not the financial projections of a successful merger. They were the meticulously documented blueprints of an attempted murder. DeAndre seamlessly cycled through the slides. First, the screens displayed the encrypted black market credit card receipts. The transactions were explicitly linked to a fabricated corporate identity that DeAndre had expertly traced directly back to Nolan's private server. Next came the offshore wire transfers, highlighting the exact sums of money Nolan had siphoned from my personal accounts to purchase the toxic heavy metal from an unregulated overseas supplier. The crowd erupted into furious, shocked whispers. I saw Patricia and Richard sink into their chairs in the front row, looking physically ill. Vanessa was shaking uncontrollably, her hands covering her face, as the evidence of their lethal conspiracy was broadcast to the highest echelons of the city's elite. I directed the audience's attention to the final slide. DeAndre projected the certified laboratory results from my independent toxicologist displaying the exact chemical breakdown of the thallium they had been slipping into my daily vitamins. Placed right beside it was the purchase order for Prussian Blue, the medical antidote I had been secretly taking to neutralize their poison. I explained how Nolan and Vanessa had turned my home into a slow-moving execution chamber, fully intending to murder me so they could bypass my prenuptial agreement and inherit my company to cover Nolan's catastrophic $20 million hedge fund deficit. The sheer magnitude of the exposure finally snapped Nolan out of his paralyzed shock. The survival instincts of a cornered rat kicked in. His face twisted into a mask of wild, desperate fury. He lunged toward the edge of the stage, screaming at the top of his lungs for the hotel security team. He pointed a shaking finger at me and DeAndre, demanding that we be forcefully removed from the premises. He shouted to the Apex executives that I was a deranged, trespassing lunatic who was attempting to sabotage a legally binding corporate transition with forged documents. 4 broad-shouldered hotel security guards immediately rushed down the center aisle, responding to the chaotic demands of the man who had rented the ballroom. But they never even made it to the first step of the stage. The 2 federal agents who had been standing quietly at the back of the room moved with explosive speed. They stepped directly in front of the hotel security team, physically blocking their path. In perfect unison, the agents reached into their suit jackets and withdrew their silver federal badges, holding them high for the entire room to see. One of the agents spoke, his voice carrying the heavy, indisputable weight of the United States government. He ordered the hotel security to stand down immediately. He announced that no one was to approach the stage and that the ballroom was now under federal jurisdiction. Nolan stopped screaming. He froze at the edge of the stage, his hands still suspended in the air. His eyes locked onto the silver badges gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. He looked up at the massive screens displaying his offshore routing numbers, then slowly turned his head to look at me. I watched the exact second his reality completely shattered. The arrogant, untouchable corporate conqueror evaporated into nothing. He realized that the documents on the screen were not just embarrassing accusations. He realized that the men blocking the aisle were not rival corporate attorneys. He realized that this was no longer a boardroom dispute over supply chain patents and executive titles. It was a federal crime scene. Nolan took a shaky, trembling step away from the podium. His knees visibly buckled under the crushing weight of the trap he had just walked into. The air left his lungs in a sharp, pathetic wheeze. The master manipulator had finally run out of lies, and the absolute finality of his destruction was staring him right in the face. Nolan's initial shock began to curdle into a frantic, cornered rage. The survival instincts of a narcissist overrode his paralyzing fear. He grabbed the edges of the acrylic podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He leaned forward and shouted into the dead air of the ballroom, his voice cracking with desperation. He screamed that the federal agents had absolutely no jurisdiction over corporate governance. He pointed at me, declaring that I was legally incapacitated. He insisted that the power of attorney was fully notarized, completely bulletproof, and recognized by the board of directors. He yelled that he was the undisputed acting chief executive officer and that he had the absolute legal right to sell the company. He turned his wild, desperate eyes toward the front row, directly targeting the executive leadership team of Apex Corporation. He begged them to ignore the presentation screens. He promised them that the $50 million merger was fully executed, legally binding, and ready to move forward. He claimed this entire spectacle was nothing but a theatrical, malicious stunt orchestrated by a bitter, mentally unstable founder who could not handle losing her crown. I did not raise my voice to argue with him. I did not need to shout over the frantic ramblings of a drowning man. I simply took a step back from the podium and gave a brief nod to Vaughn. My 50-year-old corporate attorney adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit jacket. He walked up the short flight of stairs with the calm, predatory grace of a man who dismantled Fortune 500 companies for sport. Vaughn stepped up to the microphone. He did not yell. He spoke with a deep, resonant authority that commanded absolute silence from the panicked crowd. He fixed his gaze entirely on the chief executive officer of Apex Corporation sitting in the front row. Vaughn informed the Apex leadership team that they might want to carefully review the fine print of the acquisition documents Nolan had just forced upon them. He stated that my treacherous husband was actually correct about one specific thing. The power of attorney was indeed legally binding. Nolan had successfully used it to oust me, and he had legitimately claimed the title of acting chief executive of my original corporation. Vaughn let a dark, humorless smile cross his face. He leaned into the microphone and explained that a corporate title is only as valuable as the assets it commands. At the back of the room, DeAndre seamlessly switched the digital projection on the massive screens. The horrifying laboratory results vanished, replaced by a new set of heavily redacted, meticulously filed corporate charters. Vaughn gestured to the screens and broke down the ultimate counter-maneuver I had executed. He explained that exactly 1 month before my highly publicized medical collapse at our anniversary dinner, I had quietly established a completely anonymous holding company registered in Delaware. Because I was the sole founder and acting chief executive at that time, I possessed the unilateral, unquestionable authority to restructure my own corporate assets. And I had done exactly that with ruthless surgical efficiency. Vaughn walked the stunned audience through the legal massacre. He detailed how I had legally and permanently transferred every single proprietary supply chain algorithm out of the original company. I had moved every international patent, every line of source code, and every piece of vital intellectual property directly into the impenetrable vault of the new holding company. Furthermore, I had quietly renegotiated and reassigned all of our core client contracts, ensuring that the massive revenue streams followed the intellectual property. I had moved the entire heartbeat of my empire into a heavily fortified legal fortress that Nolan did not even know existed, let alone have the legal authority to touch. I stepped back up to the microphone, standing shoulder to shoulder with my attorney. I looked down at Nolan. His face had gone completely slack, his mouth hanging slightly open as the catastrophic reality of the situation finally pierced his arrogant skull. I explained the true nature of his grand corporate conquest. I wanted to spell it out for him so there could be absolutely no misunderstanding. I told him that the company he had so viciously stolen from me, the company he had just proudly sold to our biggest rival for $50 million, was nothing but a hollow, rotting carcass. I leaned forward, my voice dripping with cold, venomous satisfaction. I told Nolan that he currently owned the lease to a large glass building downtown. He legally owned the ergonomic office chairs, the mahogany conference tables, and the branded coffee mugs sitting in the employee break room. He owned the name on the front door, but he owned absolutely none of the technology that made that name worth a single dime. The reaction from the Apex executives was instantaneous and violent. The chief executive of Apex stood up so fast his heavy chair crashed backward onto the ballroom floor. The color drained from his face as he realized that Nolan had just tried to sell them a completely empty box for $50 million. The Apex legal team immediately pulled out their phones frantically, whispering to each other as they realized they had been publicly humiliated and nearly defrauded on a massive catastrophic scale. They had bypassed standard due diligence because Nolan had promised them a rapid, highly secretive acquisition of their biggest competitor. Now they were standing in the middle of a federal crime scene holding a worthless piece of paper. Nolan stumbled backward, gripping his hair with both hands. He looked at Vanessa, who was currently hyperventilating near the edge of the stage, her hands clutching her pregnant stomach in sheer terror. He looked at his mother, Patricia, who was sobbing openly in the front row, realizing that the luxury estate and the extravagant renovations she had planned were entirely evaporating before her eyes. Nolan had sacrificed his marriage, compromised his freedom, and attempted to murder his wife just to steal an empty shell. He had thought he was the smartest man in the room, outmaneuvering everyone to claim the ultimate prize. Instead, he had walked blindly into a legal guillotine that had just severed his corporate head clean off his shoulders. The silence in the grand ballroom was so absolute, you could hear the soft hum of the crystal chandeliers vibrating overhead. Nolan stared at the massive presentation screens, his mind desperately trying to reject the reality of his own catastrophic failure. The empty shell company was a devastating blow, but the true brilliance of our counter-offensive had not even been fully revealed yet. DeAndre stepped forward. My fiercely intelligent brother-in-law moved with the calculated precision of a man who had waited months to deliver this exact execution. He took the microphone from Vaughn and looked out over the sea of horrified executives. DeAndre did not raise his voice. He spoke with the cold, measured tone of an auditor delivering a final damning verdict. He directed the attention of the room back to the digital screens. With a single tap on his tablet, DeAndre replaced the corporate charters with a dense, highly complex financial ledger. Bright red numbers flooded the display, casting a harsh, bloody glow over the front rows of the audience. DeAndre explained that a brilliant chief executive officer does not simply abandon an empty corporate shell. She weaponizes it. When I transferred the valuable intellectual property and the lucrative client contracts into my hidden holding company, I did not dissolve the original entity. Instead, I used my ultimate executive authority to legally restructure our worst-performing assets. I took every ounce of toxic debt from a failing overseas logistics subsidiary and anchored it directly into the shell company. It was a massive, highly aggressive, high-yield debt package totaling exactly $40 million. A collective gasp ripped through the audience of elite investors. They instantly recognized the lethal nature of the financial instrument displayed on the screen. Nolan looked up at DeAndre, his breathing shallow and rapid. He stammered that corporate debt belonged to the corporation, not to the executives. He desperately tried to cling to the basic principles of limited liability, insisting that the $40 million deficit was my problem to solve, not his. DeAndre let out a low, dark laugh that chilled the room. He leaned into the microphone and dismantled Nolan's final desperate hope. He explained the lethal legal trap that Vaughn had so masterfully buried inside the fraudulent paperwork. By using a fabricated medical proxy to bypass the board of directors, and by unilaterally forcing the Apex merger without proper financial due diligence or shareholder ratification, Nolan had committed gross fiduciary negligence. DeAndre pointed directly at the shredded remains of the champagne glass at Nolan's feet. He stated that when Nolan arrogantly signed the Apex acquisition contract as the acting chief executive officer, he ignored a standard but highly lethal indemnification waiver. By acting illegally and in bad faith, Nolan had entirely pierced the corporate veil. He did not just sell a company, he had legally, permanently, and personally guaranteed every single liability attached to that empty shell. The mathematical reality of his destruction hung heavy in the air. DeAndre looked down from the stage and counted out the absolute ruin of my husband. He reminded the room that Nolan was already hiding a $20 million crater in his fraudulent hedge fund. Now, thanks to his own greedy, unchecked arrogance, he had just personally shackled himself to an additional $40 million of unpayable corporate debt. He did not secure a $50 million payout to save his life. He had just enthusiastically signed his name to a $60 million death warrant. The reaction from the front row was explosive. The chief executive officer of Apex Corporation did not hesitate for a single second. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He snapped his fingers at his lead legal counsel. Right there in front of 500 high society guests, the Apex lawyer unclasped his leather briefcase. He pulled out the thick, freshly signed merger agreements that Nolan had so proudly paraded around my living room just a few hours ago. The lawyer gripped the heavy bond paper and ripped it straight down the middle. The sharp tearing sound echoed loudly through the quiet ballroom. He threw the shredded halves of the contract directly onto the floor at Nolan's feet. The Apex CEO stepped forward, pointing a shaking finger directly at my husband's face. He promised in a low, dangerous growl that if Nolan ever dared to mention the Apex brand name again, he would unleash an army of corporate litigators to bury him so deep in civil suits he would never see the light of day. Without another word, the Apex executives turned as a single furious unit. They marched down the center aisle, their heavy footsteps sounding like a military retreat. The heavy gold-leaf doors swung open and swallowed them whole, leaving Nolan entirely defenseless. The departure of the Apex team was the final blow that broke him completely. The last remnants of strength left Nolan's legs. He physically collapsed, his knees hitting the hardwood floor of the ballroom with a dull thud. He landed right in the center of the shattered crystal from his celebratory toast, but he did not even seem to feel the sharp shards pressing into his expensive tailored trousers. He looked like a hollow, terrified shell of a man. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. He slowly turned his head to look for his co-conspirators, desperately searching for a lifeline that no longer existed. Vanessa was backing away from the stage as fast as her high heels would allow. She was clutching her pregnant stomach, looking at Nolan, not with love or partnership, but as if he were highly radioactive. Patricia and Richard were frozen in their seats, their mouths hanging open in silent horror. The extravagant architectural renovations, the luxury penthouses, and the lives of untouchable wealth they had all planned were evaporating into a nightmare of catastrophic bankruptcy. Nolan knelt in the debris of his own arrogance, completely surrounded by the wreckage of his life. He was utterly bankrupt, chained to millions of dollars in fraudulent debt, and staring directly at the federal agents, who were now stepping out of the shadows to claim him. The two federal agents moved with synchronized, terrifying purpose. They stepped past the ruined acquisition contracts and the shattered champagne crystal scattered across the polished hardwood floor. Their dark suits cut a sharp contrast against the glittering backdrop of the luxury ballroom. They did not rush. They did not need to. They cornered Nolan exactly where he knelt, a broken, bankrupt man, utterly paralyzed by his own catastrophic failure. One of the agents unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic rattle cut through the dead silence of the room. He looked down at my husband and formally announced that Nolan was being taken into federal custody. The agent listed the charges with clinical precision, citing massive financial fraud, corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and the premeditated attempted murder of his wife. The reality of a federal prison sentence finally penetrated Nolan's shock. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, his expensive bespoke suit tearing against the broken glass. He looked wildly toward the front row, his eyes locking onto Vanessa. He reached a desperate, bleeding hand out to his pregnant mistress, silently begging for her to intervene to corroborate his lies, or to somehow save him from the abyss. Vanessa did exactly what a parasite does when its host begins to die. She immediately detached herself to ensure her own survival. Faced with the terrifying prospect of federal agents and decades behind bars, the absolute illusion of their grand romance evaporated in a single heartbeat. Vanessa physically recoiled from Nolan as if he were covered in flames. She stumbled backward, her hands flying up defensively as she pressed her back against the ballroom wall. She opened her mouth and let out a frantic, piercing scream. She pointed a trembling finger directly at the man she had just kissed in my foyer. She told the federal agents that she had absolutely nothing to do with the heavy metal poisoning. Her voice cracked with hysterical, manufactured panic. She claimed that Nolan was a controlling, abusive monster who had manipulated her into this entire conspiracy. She swore she thought the hospital paperwork was just standard corporate protocol. She wrapped her arms protectively around her slight baby bump and played the ultimate victim card, crying out that she was just an innocent, terrified, pregnant woman who had been completely brainwashed by a predatory hedge fund manager. Nolan stared at her, his jaw hanging open in sheer disbelief. The ultimate betrayal struck him harder than the financial ruin. The woman he had stolen $500,000 to impress the woman he had actively tried to murder me for was currently throwing him under a federal bus without a single second of hesitation. He tried to speak to call her a liar, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The two lovers had morphed into bitter, vicious enemies in the blink of an eye. I watched her pathetic, desperate performance from the stage. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with her frantic lies. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my crimson blazer and retrieved my burner phone. I gave DeAndre a brief nod. My brilliant brother-in-law immediately bypassed the ballroom's main audiovisual board and synced the hotel's massive surround sound system directly to my device. I looked down at Vanessa, who was still loudly weeping and claiming absolute innocence to the unimpressed federal agents. I tapped the screen of my phone and pressed play. The audio file did not just play, it thundered through the ballroom. The state-of-the-art acoustic system projected the crisp, undeniable recording I had captured from my hospital bed just weeks ago. Every single executive investor and high society guest in the room heard the quiet, sinister whisper of Vanessa's own voice echoing off the gold-leafed ceiling. "Are you absolutely sure she took the final dose?" The recording captured her cold, calculating tone perfectly. Then the speakers broadcast Nolan's quiet, satisfied laugh. "Relax. By tomorrow morning, the CEO seat and everything else will be ours." The digital playback shut off, leaving the ballroom drowning in a heavy, suffocating silence. I stepped up to the edge of the stage, looking directly into Vanessa's terrified, wide eyes. I told her that she was an absolutely terrible actress. I reminded her that I had spent a decade building a supply chain empire from dirt, surrounded by the most ruthless corporate sharks in the world. Did she honestly believe she was smart enough to orchestrate an assassination right in front of me and leave no receipts? Vanessa's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. The audio checkmate had completely severed her only lifeline. She could not claim ignorance. She could not play the manipulated victim. The entire ballroom had just heard her eagerly confirming the administration of a lethal poison. She was a fully aware, highly enthusiastic co-conspirator to premeditated murder. The second federal agent stepped forward, completely ignoring her tears. He grabbed Vanessa by the arm, spinning her around with forceful, unapologetic authority. He pulled her wrists behind her back. The sharp mechanical click of the steel handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed loudly across the room. A second later, his partner hoisted Nolan up from the floor by the scruff of his ruined suit jacket, slamming another pair of heavy steel cuffs around his bleeding wrists. The agents read them their Miranda rights in perfect, overlapping unison. The cold, monotone recitation of their legal rights served as the final, brutal punctuation mark to their absolute destruction. The federal agents turned them around and began the long, agonizing march down the center aisle of the VIP ballroom. They did not try to hide them. They paraded the two traitors right through the middle of the crowd. The high society guests, the elite investors, and the former colleagues stood in stunned, dead silence. No one offered a word of comfort. No one stepped forward to help. The crowd simply watched, their eyes wide with shock and morbid fascination, as the arrogant hedge fund manager and his treacherous mistress were dragged away in disgrace. A few guests even pulled out their smartphones mercilessly, recording the humiliating perp walk to ensure their social and professional annihilation would be broadcast across the internet before they even reached the police cruisers downstairs. I stood on the stage in my crimson suit, my posture rigid and my expression carved from ice. I watched the heavy ballroom doors swing shut behind them, sealing their fate. My husband and my former best friend had walked into this hotel expecting to be crowned royalty. Instead, they were leaving in the back of a federal transport vehicle, stripped of their wealth, their dignity, and their freedom. The morning sun broke over the horizon, casting a sharp, unforgiving light across the estate. I pulled up to the wrought iron gates in the back of a black sport utility vehicle. The massive stone house stood exactly as I had left it, but the energy surrounding it had entirely shifted. It was no longer a golden cage or a crime scene. It was a reclaimed fortress. I stepped out of the vehicle, smoothing the lapels of a fresh tailored black blazer. DeAndre walked beside me, holding a thick manila folder. Vaughn had already handled the law enforcement logistics, ensuring a marked patrol car was parked discreetly at the end of the street, waiting for my signal. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front doors and pushed them open. The grand foyer was in a state of absolute frantic chaos. The sounds of clattering metal and tearing canvas echoed from the formal dining room. I walked silently across the marble floor, my heels clicking with deliberate, measured precision. I stood in the arched doorway of the dining room and watched the pathetic spectacle unfold. Patricia and Richard were acting like desperate scavengers on a sinking ship. Richard was hastily pulling a priceless original oil painting off the wall, his hands fumbling with the heavy, gilded frame. Patricia was frantically shoving my imported sterling silverware and crystal decanters into a large canvas duffel bag. They had obviously seen the morning news covering Nolan's high-profile arrest. They knew the federal agents were actively seizing his assets, and they were trying to loot my home for anything of value before they fled the city. I cleared my throat. The sound cracked like a whip through the room. Richard jumped, nearly dropping the heavy oil painting onto the hardwood floor. Patricia spun around, dropping a handful of silver forks. Her face drained of all color, her eyes wide with the exact same terror her son had displayed on the ballroom stage. She looked at me, taking in my sharp business attire, and the unwavering predatory calm radiating from my posture. She stammered, trying to formulate an excuse, claiming they were just securing my valuables because the house would inevitably be seized by the federal authorities to cover Nolan's massive hedge fund debts. I did not entertain her pathetic lies. I held out my hand, and DeAndre placed a crisp, legally certified document onto my palm. I walked forward and slapped the paper directly onto the dining room table right next to Patricia's looted duffel bag. I told them it was a formal, immediate eviction notice. Patricia stared at the document, her hands trembling. She shrieked that the house belonged to Nolan, that he had transferred the deed to himself, using the power of attorney, and that she had a legal right to remain on the property. I let out a cold, sharp laugh. I leaned over the table, looking my mother-in-law dead in the eyes. I explained that her son was a remarkably arrogant, incredibly stupid man. I told her that my estate was never listed under my personal name. Years before I even met Nolan, I had placed the deed to the property inside an impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust managed by an offshore corporate entity. I informed her that the power of attorney Nolan had forced me to sign was completely powerless against that trust. He never owned a single brick, a single window, or a single blade of grass on this property. He could not transfer the deed because he did not possess the legal clearance to even look at the authentic title. The reality of her absolute destitution finally crashed down on Patricia. The extravagant architectural renovations, the open-concept entertainment pavilion, the luxury lifestyle she had envisioned, it was all a humiliating fantasy. Her knees buckled and she sank into one of the dining chairs. She began to weep desperately, grasping at the sleeve of my blazer. She begged for mercy. She cried that they had nowhere to go, that Richard was unemployed, and that Nolan's criminal defense would bankrupt them completely. She actually had the audacity to play the family card, pleading that we were bound by marriage, begging me not to throw her out onto the street. I pulled my arm out of her grip with a sharp, disgusted motion. I told her that family does not measure a woman's living room for demolition while she is dying in a wheelchair upstairs. I signaled DeAndre again. My brother-in-law pulled a second highly detailed document from his folder and handed it to me. I dropped it directly onto Patricia's lap. I explained that it was an itemized, legally binding invoice. I had meticulously calculated the replacement value of every single custom-tailored power suit, silk blouse, and designer coat she had callously thrown into cardboard boxes to donate. I added the exorbitant fees the contractor had charged to knock down my custom fireplace and damage my load-bearing walls. The total came to exactly $35,000. I told her that my corporate litigators would be aggressively pursuing her for every single cent, and if she could not pay, they would gladly seize whatever pathetic personal assets she had left to her name. Richard tried to step forward, puffing out his chest in a weak display of physical intimidation, but DeAndre instantly blocked his path. My brother-in-law did not say a word. He simply crossed his arms, his imposing presence entirely neutralizing Richard's fake bravado. I looked at the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I turned back to Patricia and delivered my final mandate. I told them they had exactly 10 minutes to drop the stolen silverware, pack their own cheap suitcases, and walk out of my front door. I informed them that if they were still standing on my property when the clock struck the hour, the police cruiser parked at the end of the street would be rolling up the driveway to arrest them both for criminal trespassing and grand larceny. Panic completely overrode their greed. Richard dropped the oil painting against the wall and sprinted toward the guest bedrooms to grab his bags. Patricia left the duffel bag of silver on the table, stumbling over her own feet as she rushed up the stairs, sobbing uncontrollably. The illusion of their superiority was entirely shattered, leaving nothing but two desperate parasites scrambling to escape the fortress they had tried to steal. Exactly 90 days after I stood in my marble foyer and watched the parasites flee my estate, I found myself sitting in the rigid wooden gallery of a federal courthouse. The air inside the room was heavy, smelling of lemon polish and absolute institutional defeat. Vaughn sat comfortably to my right, looking as relaxed as if he were attending a casual Sunday brunch. DeAndre sat to my left, his dark eyes fixed intensely on the defense table. There were no bespoke suits or tailored cashmere dresses today. Nolan and Vanessa sat entirely broken, stripped of their high society armor, and dressed in identical shapeless orange jumpsuits. The arrogant hedge fund manager who had tried to bury me alive was completely unrecognizable. His hair was thinning, his posture was violently hunched, and his hands shook uncontrollably as they rested on the defense table. Vanessa sat beside him, weeping silently, her face pale and devoid of the smug superiority she had worn while parading around my home. They did not even look at each other. The toxic alliance they had built on greed and betrayal had completely shattered the moment the steel handcuffs locked around their wrists. The federal judge presiding over the case was a stern, uncompromising man who had absolutely zero patience for white-collar criminals playing the victim. He struck his wooden gavel and delivered a sentencing mandate that echoed through the silent courtroom like thunder. He addressed Nolan first. The judge listed the catastrophic timeline of offenses with clinical disgust. He cited the $20 million hedge fund fraud, the corporate embezzlement, the forged medical proxies, and the calculated, premeditated attempt to murder a spouse with heavy metals. The judge stared down at my husband and stated that his actions represented the absolute pinnacle of human depravity and corporate greed. He sentenced Nolan to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Nolan did not speak. He did not cry out. He simply dropped his head into his shaking hands, fully absorbing the terrifying reality that his life as a free man was officially over. The judge then turned his attention to Vanessa. Her defense attorney had spent weeks desperately trying to paint her as an innocent, manipulated pregnant woman who had been coerced into the plot by a predatory man. The judge immediately shut that narrative down. He explicitly referenced the crystal-clear audio recording I had captured from the hospital room, reminding the court that Vanessa had eagerly confirmed the administration of a lethal poison. She was an active, enthusiastic co-conspirator to attempted murder. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in a federal women's correctional facility. Vanessa collapsed against the defense table, her frantic sobs filling the room as the bailiff stepped forward to escort them both back to their holding cells. I sat perfectly still, watching the heavy courtroom doors swing shut behind them. I felt no pity, no lingering heartbreak, and no remorse. The universe had demanded a reckoning, and I had personally delivered the executioner's block. The absolute destruction of my enemies did not stop at the courtroom doors. While Nolan and Vanessa traded their luxury penthouses for concrete cells, the collateral damage completely incinerated Patricia and Richard. When the federal authorities seized Nolan's assets, my mother-in-law and brother-in-law had panicked. Convinced that Nolan could somehow beat the charges and restore their path to unimaginable wealth, they had foolishly liquidated every single asset they owned to hire a team of high-powered, aggressively expensive defense attorneys. They drained their retirement accounts, emptied their meager savings, and sold whatever valuable possessions they had left. The defense team took their money, lost the case spectacularly, and walked away, leaving Patricia and Richard completely destitute. They were evicted from their comfortable suburban rental shortly after the trial concluded. They ended up signing a lease on a tiny run-down one-bedroom apartment on the extreme industrial outskirts of the city. I had Vaughn's private investigators verify the location just to close the file. The investigators reported that the building was situated next to a noisy freight train track plagued by faulty plumbing and peeling linoleum floors. It was exactly the kind of impoverished working-class environment that Patricia had spent her entire life mocking and looking down upon. To seal their financial coffin, Vaughn's law firm aggressively pursued the $35,000 invoice I had handed Patricia on the day I evicted her from my estate. Since she had no liquid cash left, Vaughn legally garnished the remaining scraps of her state benefits and Richard's minimum wage paychecks. Every single month, a percentage of their pathetic income was automatically routed directly into my corporate accounts to pay for the walls they had so arrogantly demolished. They were officially trapped in a cycle of poverty, paying off a debt for a mansion they tried to steal. The final brilliant stroke of justice belonged entirely to DeAndre. While the federal prosecutors handled the criminal convictions, my brother-in-law waged a merciless financial war to reclaim my stolen wealth. He targeted the luxury penthouse condo that Nolan had purchased for Vanessa using my embezzled funds. Vanessa's lawyers had attempted to argue that the $500,000 property was a legitimate gift and thus shielded from asset seizure. DeAndre absolutely shredded their defense. He provided the federal financial regulators with a flawless, irrefutable paper trail mapping every single dollar from my private high-yield savings account straight into the real estate brokerage's escrow. Because the funds were obtained through documented wire fraud and corporate embezzlement, the federal government swiftly froze the deed. DeAndre did not just stop at freezing the asset. He worked directly with the federal liquidators to force an immediate expedited sale of the luxury penthouse. Within 60 days, the property was sold to an overseas buyer. By the time the ink dried on the closing documents, DeAndre had successfully clawed back every single stolen cent. He ensured that the entire $500,000 was legally and securely routed right back into my private accounts, completely untouched by the legal fees or court costs. I walked out of the federal courthouse that afternoon, flanked by the two men who had helped me orchestrate the greatest turnaround of my life. The sky above the city was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The cold, suffocating nightmare that Nolan had tried to drag me into was finally permanently over. The dust had settled, the wreckage was cleared, and the empire I had built was entirely mine once again. 6 months later, the air inside the New York Stock Exchange vibrated with a raw electric energy. It was a chaotic symphony of shouting traders, ringing phones, and the relentless hum of global capitalism. I stood on the iconic balcony overlooking the massive trading floor, my hands resting lightly on the polished wooden railing. Massive silk banners cascaded from the vaulted ceiling, displaying the sleek, redesigned logo of my holding company. The very same anonymous entity I had created in the shadows to protect my intellectual property was now stepping into the blinding light of the public market. I wore a pristine white tailored suit today, a stark departure from the crimson armor I had worn to slaughter my enemies at the hotel gala. The red suit was for war. The white suit was for total, undeniable victory. The financial press had spent the last 6 months dissecting my corporate maneuver. They called it the most ruthless, brilliant defensive restructure in modern Silicon Valley history. When the dust settled from Nolan's arrest and the Apex Corporation fled the crime scene in absolute terror, I had seamlessly transitioned my patents, my elite engineering teams, and my massive logistics contracts into this new corporate structure. We had not just survived the attempted hostile takeover, we had aggressively expanded our market share. The street was ravenous for our initial public offering. The underwriters had priced our opening shares at a premium, and the pre-market indicators suggested we were about to experience a massive, unprecedented surge in valuation. I turned my head away from the bustling trading floor below and looked at the three people standing right beside me on the balcony. They were not smiling for the cameras or posing for financial magazines. They were smiling entirely for me. To my right stood Vaughn. My brilliant corporate attorney wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his arms crossed comfortably over his chest. He looked down at the trading floor with the satisfied, quiet pride of a master architect watching his greatest blueprint come to life. He had drafted the legal traps that saved my empire, standing as an impenetrable shield when the wolves were at my door. He was the one who had ensured the paperwork was a lethal weapon rather than a surrender document. To my left stood my sister Bridget. She reached out and squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with absolute unfiltered joy. She had flown across the country the second she learned the truth about my collapse, dropping everything to help me rebuild the personal pieces of my life. She did not ask questions or offer hollow platitudes. She simply showed up and anchored me to reality while the legal battles raged in the background. Standing right beside Bridget was DeAndre. My brother-in-law looked imposing and sharp in a deep navy suit, his dark eyes scanning the room with the same meticulous focus he used to dismantle fraudulent ledgers. DeAndre was the African-American forensic accountant who had crawled through the digital mud to find the offshore accounts, the luxury penthouse deed, and the lethal toxicology reports. He had navigated the dark web to find the black market credit card receipts that ultimately sealed a federal attempted murder conviction. He was the one who had brought me the weapons I needed to survive. He caught me looking at him and gave me a slow, deeply respectful nod. I squeezed Bridget's hand back and held DeAndre's gaze. This was my true family. They were not bound to me by shallow societal obligations or fake polite dinner party smiles. They were forged in the absolute darkest, most terrifying moment of my life. When the man I married tried to put me in the ground, and my in-laws tried to loot my home for silver and art, these three people had formed an impenetrable wall around me. They were the ones who stood by me when the vultures circled, proving that family is not defined by a marriage certificate. Family is defined by who hands you a sword when you are fighting for your life. A sudden surge of noise pulled my attention back to the trading floor. A floor director in a sharp jacket stepped onto the balcony holding a digital tablet. He looked at me, his face glowing with professional excitement, and announced that we were exactly 60 seconds away from the opening bell. The cameras positioned around the balcony zoomed in, broadcasting my face to financial news networks across the globe. The massive digital clock on the wall behind the podium began its final relentless countdown. The voices of hundreds of traders below began to chant the numbers in unison, their shouts echoing off the marble pillars. I stepped forward and placed my hand firmly over the polished brass button that controlled the ceremonial opening bell. My pulse remained perfectly steady. I did not feel a single trace of the weak, dying woman who had lain trembling in a VIP hospital bed 6 months ago. That woman was a phantom, a temporary ghost I had created to lure my enemies into a fatal trap. While Nolan sat rotting in a concrete federal cell, I was standing at the absolute pinnacle of global commerce. 10, 9, 8. The chanting grew louder, a roaring wave of anticipation. 3, 2, 1. I pushed the button down with absolute, unwavering force. The sharp, resonant clang of the opening bell shattered the air. The trading floor immediately erupted into a deafening roar of applause and shouting. Confetti rained down from the ceiling, catching the bright studio lights as the massive digital screens flashed green. Our stock ticker symbol appeared on the main board, and the opening price instantly surged upward, climbing millions of dollars in valuation in a matter of seconds. I looked out over the cheering crowd, my white suit glowing under the flashes of a dozen cameras. I took a deep, steady breath, letting the chaotic, beautiful noise of absolute victory wash over me. I delivered a sharp internal monologue, a final vow to myself amidst the roaring applause. They thought my kindness was weakness. They thought they could bury me alive and feast on my life's work. But they forgot one crucial rule of business. A true CEO never leaves a vulnerability unpatched. They dug a grave for me, but I just used it as the foundation to build my empire. The story of Cassidy's survival is a masterclass in emotional restraint and strategic resilience. The most profound lesson here is that true power lies in the quiet, calculated response to betrayal, not in the immediate explosion of anger. When faced with ultimate treachery, she didn't let emotions dictate her actions. She weaponized their underestimation of her. Furthermore, it beautifully illustrates that genuine family isn't determined by proximity or titles, but by the loyal few who stand beside you when the wolves circle. Have you ever had to strategically walk away from a toxic relationship? Share your story in the comments below.